In Edinburgh, 1871, amid pressed ferns and quiet dust, Prudence Carrow, the overlooked eldest, meets a stranger who bends the air, Benedict Kinross, the widowed Earl of Thornhaven. He offers not love, but alliance, not roses, but responsibility. One calling card on the counter, one question in her chest: accept a life of duty, or risk the dangerous hope she buried years ago. A secret refusal, a family's quiet debts, a Highland estate humming with rumour. Everything begins here, in a shop that smells of lavender and rain. A storm is coming, and her answer will alter a valley. Share where you're listening from, and tell me, in period romances, do you crave slow-burn partnership, scandal, or redemption? Edinburgh, Scotland. Early autumn of the year 1871. The air in the city was beginning to sharpen, carrying with it the first whisper of the coming frost. Along the narrow cobblestone lanes of the old town, morning light filtered through soot-streaked windows, and the lingering fog curled like a living thing beneath the carriages. Within a modest storefront, nestled between a milliner's shop and an apothecary, the world moved with a quieter rhythm. Inside Carrow & Sons' natural curiosities, order reigned. Dried ferns framed the windows like lace, and labelled glass domes protected the fragile remains of moths and seed pods. The scent of old parchment, lavender oil, and pressed eucalyptus hung in the stillness. At the back of the shop, Prudence Carrow, aged 33, bent over her work table with the solemn grace of a woman long used to her solitude. Her hands, long, ink-stained, precise, moved steadily as she arranged a specimen of harebell beneath parchment. Her eyes, a hazel green touched by quiet light, narrowed in concentration. Her dress, simple but impeccably clean, was the soft grey of Scottish stone, high-collared and modestly adorned with a single silver thistle brooch. She did not require ornament. Her elegance was born of restraint, of knowledge, and of years spent knowing her place in the world, even as it shifted away from her. Her 3 younger sisters had married, beautifully, brilliantly. Their homes were now in Surrey, York, and one even in India. Letters arrived with gold-trimmed paper and tales of husbands with government titles, hunting lodges, and so many carriages. Prudence answered every letter faithfully, folding them with care, sealing them with wax, and placing them on the windowsill to dry beneath the afternoon sun. Not once did she resent them, but not once did she envy them either. It was nearly 11 o'clock when the bell above the shop door rang, not with its usual chime, but with a deeper resonance, as though it had been startled into song. Prudence lifted her head, expecting the vicar's wife or one of the academy boys seeking seaweed for a portfolio. Instead, the man who stepped inside seemed to bend the very air around him. He was tall enough to make the low ceiling feel too near. Broad-shouldered, with a bearing that belonged not to the city, but to the kind of wilderness where pine trees grew old and unchallenged. His coat, dark green tweed lined with grey, was damp at the cuffs, and his boots bore the dust of distant roads. His face was angular, handsome in a way that seemed carved rather than gifted, and his eyes, blue as the North Sea at twilight, swept the room with a practiced detachment. For one moment, Prudence felt the stillness rupture. She stood slowly, brushing her hands against her skirt, steadying her voice before it rose. "May I assist you, sir?" His gaze settled on her, and for a moment neither moved. Then he stepped forward and removed his gloves with deliberate precision. "I am Benedict Kinross, Earl of Thornhaven." The name fell into the air like a stone into water. Prudence did not bow, nor did she falter, but she did go very still. "I know who you are, my lord," she replied softly. "What brings you to a botanical shop in Edinburgh?" He glanced briefly around the space, then returned his gaze to her. "You, Miss Carrow." There was no hesitation in his voice, no warmth, but no cruelty either. He spoke like a man who had practiced difficult conversations on horseback in wind. She said nothing, waiting. "I require a wife," he continued, "and I have no wish to be dishonest about the reasons. I do not seek affection, nor youth, nor beauty. What I need is a woman of sense. A woman whose name commands respect, even in modest circles. A woman who will not weep when winter cuts into the glen. A silence followed that stretched into the bones of the room. Then, finally, she allowed herself to speak. And what, precisely, does a wife gain from such an arrangement? The Earl's brow lifted slightly. Security, position, a voice in the running of an estate that, should it fail, will see entire families ruined. It was not a seduction, it was a contract. And yet, beneath the formality, she felt something else, buried deep within him, like a wound that refused to heal. She did not answer him. Not then. He left her with a calling card bearing his crest and a small detail she would not forget, the faint smudge of soil beneath his left thumbnail. He worked his land then, or at least walked it. She respected that. That night, sleep would not come. Prudence sat at her writing desk by candlelight, turning the card over in her hand. She remembered another man years ago, a charming professor's assistant with warm hands and foolish dreams. He had asked her to marry him, not for love, though he said the word. He wanted someone to host his academic dinners, to index his monographs, to bear his children between lecture terms. When she declined, gently but firmly, he had called her cold. Prudence had not been cold, only unwilling to be used. She lit a second candle and opened her botanical journal. Her fingers hovered over the page. Instead of drawing, she wrote a single sentence. I will not be ornamental. I will be essential. And so, when the carriage bearing Thornhaven's crest arrived the next morning, Prudence Carrow stepped into it. Not as a woman swept away by romance, but as a woman who knew her worth and was ready to test it against a Highland winter. The journey northward unfolded beneath a sky swollen with grey. Rain had not yet fallen, but it lingered in the clouds like something unsaid. The carriage wheels creaked as they left the polished avenues of Edinburgh behind and wound their way into the rugged embrace of the Highlands. Rock and heather replaced cobblestone and terrace. Civilization faded into mist and moss. The trees grew older here, bent by wind, rooted in silence. It was a land shaped by time and resistance, as unyielding as it was hauntingly beautiful. Inside the coach, Prudence Carrow sat with her spine erect, gloved hands folded neatly on her lap, her thoughts as tightly bound as the travelling cloak around her shoulders. She had not spoken since they passed the last village. Speech felt like a luxury too extravagant for the moment. A new life awaited her beyond the veil of fog, and though she had accepted it with a steady hand, the weight of that choice now pressed against her ribs. As they crested a rise, the house came into view. Thornhaven Hall did not announce itself with grandeur or gleam. It brooded, a stately, weathered structure of grey stone, partially shrouded in ivy and surrounded by sentinel pines. It loomed like a memory refusing to be forgotten. Turrets rose in quiet defiance of the sky, smoke curled from a distant chimney, and in every line of its architecture, Prudence sensed not warmth, but waiting. The carriage halted before the front steps with a muffled thud. The coachman descended, then opened the door with a respectful nod. A gust of cold air followed. Prudence stepped out slowly, boots landing on gravel as her gaze swept upward. The front door was already ajar. At the threshold stood a woman in mourning black. The Dowager Countess of Thornhaven was not a figure easily ignored. Her stature was tall, her posture straight, despite the slender cane resting in her right hand. Her gown, of deepest jet with violet undertones, shimmered faintly with crepe and beads that caught no light. Beneath her lace widow's cap, silver hair was braided and coiled into a crown of quiet control. Her eyes, the colour of steel and no warmer, met Prudence's without hesitation. "Lady Thornhaven," she said, though her voice held none of the deference custom might dictate. "Welcome." Prudence curtsied, neither too deeply nor too perfunctorily. "Thank you, madam." The journey was smooth. The dowager inclined her head, offering no smile. You will find that smoothness is not a frequent guest here." With that, she turned and walked inside, her cane tapping softly against the flagstone floor. Prudence followed. The entrance hall swallowed her in shadow. High ceilings arched above like the nave of a cathedral. Dark wood panelled the walls, carved in motifs of thistle and oak. Heavy portraits of ancestors long buried watched from their gilded frames, their expressions stern and unsmiling. But none drew the eye like the one above the central stair. A woman, young, golden-haired, eyes of tranquil blue, draped in a lavender silk gown, and framed by painted wildflowers, her figure seemed to float, ethereal and untouched. Her hands rested lightly on the shoulders of a small girl, no older than 4. Prudence did not need to ask who she was. The dowager turned her head, noting where Prudence's gaze had landed. "She was beloved," she said simply. "Her name was Catherine." Prudence nodded once. "She is beautifully remembered." "No," the dowager corrected, voice lowering. "She is remembered accurately. Beauty fades. Character remains." And then she continued walking. The house echoed with the sort of hush one associates with sanctuaries or mausoleums. No laughter, no hurried footsteps. Only the low creak of beams and the faint whistle of wind beneath the eaves. They passed through 2 archways and entered a sitting room dimly lit by a pair of candelabras. The furniture was fine, if stiff, all carved legs and embroidered cushions in jewel tones dulled by time. A tea tray had been set, but not poured. The silver pot gleamed untouched. "Your rooms are ready," said the dowager, gesturing to a footman who had materialized silently. "You will take meals in the east parlour for now. His lordship will dine separately until things are arranged." Prudence registered the pause, but did not press it. "And the child?" she asked, careful with her tone. "Elspeth is upstairs with her governess." The dowager's jaw stiffened slightly. "She is delicate. Since the loss of her mother, we have taken care not to overwhelm her." Prudence received the message beneath the words. She would not meet the girl today. She was about to speak when a sound, so slight it might have been imagined, reached her ears. A footstep, a soft breath. She turned. At the edge of the hallway, barely visible behind the carved newel post, a small face peeked through the banister. A girl, pale, watching. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, were the same shade of blue as the woman in the portrait above. Her hair, a soft brown curled into loose tendrils, framed a face too solemn for its age. In her hands, she clutched a sketchbook, worn at the edges and hugged tightly to her chest. Prudence did not move. She merely offered the faintest smile, a silent acknowledgement. The girl vanished a heartbeat later. The dowager said nothing. That evening, Prudence was led to her chambers. They were generous, with a canopy bed, a writing desk, and a tall window facing a grove of rowan trees. The fire had been lit, but the stone walls held the memory of cold. She unfastened her cloak slowly, placing it over the chair, then moved to the window. The twilight outside was soft, pale, almost tender. Mist crept low along the fields. Somewhere in the distance, a hound bayed once, then fell silent. There was no warmth in the room, only dignity. She changed into her evening dress, forest green wool with a high lace collar, and descended once more, this time to the east parlour. A footman served her a solitary supper of trout and barley. No one else joined. The dowager remained invisible. Benedict did not appear. It was as if the house itself resisted intimacy. After the meal, she wandered the lower corridor, memorizing the layout. She found a gallery of tapestries, a locked music room, and finally a small library, dusty, quiet, and filled with volumes on Highland history, botany, and estate law. She ran a hand across the spine of one, then paused. Footsteps. Not the brisk click of a servant, not the heavy stride of a man. Smaller, softer. She turned her head. There, in the corridor beyond the library, stood Elspeth. She was barefoot, the sketchbook still in her arms. She said nothing, but her eyes searched Prudence's face as if seeking something she had only seen in dreams. Prudence did not speak. She merely extended her hand, not commanding, not beckoning, an invitation. Elspeth did not take it, but she did not run. She simply nodded once, an imperceptible tilt of the chin, and disappeared again. That night in her chamber, Prudence undressed by lamplight. She traced the edge of the thistle brooch at her throat and studied her reflection. Her face looked unchanged, but something in her gaze had deepened. Not fear, not yet belonging, recognition. She had stepped into a world still governed by grief, by silence, by names spoken in reverence and wounds left untouched. But she had also seen a girl's eyes searching for something solid, and something inside her had answered. Not loudly. Not yet, but the house had taken its first breath of change, and it had tasted like her. The wind arrived with November, cold and certain, pressing against the stone walls of Thornhaven Hall like a silent messenger from the mountains beyond. It moaned softly through the chimneys at night, rattled old shutters at dawn, and brushed the barren moors with an almost reverent touch. Winter had not yet arrived in full, but it had sent its heralds, frost tracing delicate lace along the edges of windows, the scent of peat fires drifting through the halls, and a hush descending upon the estate as though the world itself had begun to hold its breath. Prudence, now settled into the daily rhythm of life at Thornhaven, did not fear the quiet. In fact, she welcomed it. There was solace in repetition, lighting her own fire each morning, tying the ribbons of her bonnet with care, and walking the estate with a notebook clutched in one hand and gloves tucked neatly in the other. These walks had become her sanctuary. Each afternoon, just after tea, she would leave the great house through the servants' entrance and follow the narrow path that curved along the low stone wall dividing the main grounds from the tenant farms. She greeted every crofter she passed with a nod, never intrusive, never aloof. She asked no questions at first, simply observed. The broken slats in one sheepfold, the half-rotted gate at the edge of the barley field, a coal delivery logged in the hall's ledger, but not yet seen by the family who waited in the cold. She took notes. Her pen moved quickly, but her thoughts did not. They lingered with each family, each field, each name spoken softly in the wind. She had not been invited to oversee the estate's management, yet she could not ignore what her eyes revealed. And though Mr. Dalziel, the steward, remained outwardly courteous, he had begun to watch her too closely. Each evening, Prudence returned with muddy hems and ink-smudged gloves. She placed her notebook on her desk, never locked, but never open to prying eyes. Her handwriting was clear, calm, almost too precise to be dangerous. Inside the house, the cold was slower to be banished. The Dowager Countess remained unyielding. She took meals alone and filled her days with embroidery and correspondence, never once inviting Prudence to sit beside her fire. Yet she did not interfere, and that, Prudence knew, was its own form of approval. Elspeth, however, was changing. The child appeared more often now, still quiet, still solemn, but no longer shadow-bound. She drifted into the library when Prudence read. She left wildflowers pressed between pages on Prudence's writing desk. One morning, she even slipped her hand into Prudence's as they walked through the hothouse, pointing wordlessly at frost-kissed orchids with a faint gleam in her eye. They did not speak much, but their silences were no longer empty. They were shared. One afternoon, Prudence found Elspeth waiting by the back stairs, sketchbook in hand. The girl held it out with a small tilt of her chin, as if offering tribute. On the open page was a pencil drawing, delicate, rough at the edges, but unmistakable. A woman's hand holding a harebell. The shading was tentative, the lines unsure, but the subject was unmistakable. Prudence touched the paper gently. "Did you draw this for me?" Elspeth nodded. A pause. Then the girl whispered, "My mother didn't like flowers." Prudence knelt slowly so they were eye to eye. "Then I'm honored you shared them with me." The girl blinked once, then turned and ran down the corridor, sketchbook tucked close like a secret. That evening, the snow came, not as a storm, but as a hush. A soft dusting fell upon the heather, settling between stones, frosting the iron gates and rooftops. Thornhaven was transformed, cloaked in silver and stillness. The firelight inside the drawing-room flickered warm against the cold glass panes, casting amber shadows that danced along the velvet curtains and oak panelling. Prudence sat alone by the hearth, a book open on her lap, though she hadn't turned the page in some time. Her thoughts wandered, back to Edinburgh, to the narrow shop filled with dried specimens and silence. There had been a kind of order in that life, a dignity, but no one had needed her. Here, amid shadows and unspoken grief, she had begun to matter. The door opened behind her. She turned. Benedict Kinross, the Earl of Thornhaven, stood in the doorway. He did not announce himself, nor apologize for the intrusion. He stepped into the room slowly, as though uncertain whether he meant to stay. He wore a dark waistcoat, and his shirt sleeves were rolled to the forearm, an unusual informality that made him seem younger, less remote. "I didn't expect company," Prudence said softly. He gave a faint smile. "Nor did I. But I heard Elspeth humming. She hums when she draws now." He nodded and approached the fire, his gaze fixed on the flames. The silence between them stretched, not uncomfortable, but full of something unspoken. After a moment, he turned toward her. "I wanted to thank you." She looked up, startled by the sincerity in his voice. "For what?" "For speaking to her, gently, as though she were not broken." Prudence closed her book. "She is not broken. She is waiting." Benedict exhaled. The firelight caught the flecks of silver in his hair, softened the hard lines of his face. "When Catherine died," he said slowly, "Elspeth stopped speaking. Not altogether, but the part of her that laughed, that played, it vanished. The governess tried, of course. I tried, but we only reminded her of absence. She sees me as something different." He met her eyes. "She sees you as someone not afraid of silence." A pause. Then, as though compelled by something he could not quite explain, he sat in the armchair across from her. The fire cracked between them. "Catherine was a good woman," he said, voice low. "Kind, beautiful, but ours was not a love story." Prudence said nothing. The weight of his confession hovered in the air, like snow yet to fall. "Our families had known each other for years," he continued. "The match was politically convenient. Land and title aligned. Expectations were met." He looked into the flames. "But we were strangers, polite, distant. I was not cruel, nor was she, but we spoke to each other as if through glass." "Did she know?" Prudence asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, she knew, and I think she grieved it in her own quiet way." Silence followed. Outside, the wind stirred the ivy along the walls. Benedict looked at her then, really looked, as though seeing her not simply as the woman who bore his name, but as a soul shaped by choices and silence and strength. "I don't know what this will become," he said, and there was no artifice in his tone. "But I would not have you think that you are stepping into a role vacated by tragedy. You are not a shadow." Prudence felt something in her chest shift, not melt, but open. She stood slowly and walked to the fireplace. As she reached to adjust the logs, her gloved hand brushed against his. It was not intentional, and yet, when their fingers touched, neither pulled away. The contact lasted only a breath, but in that breath, something passed between them. Not desire, not affection. Something older, something elemental, recognition. She drew her hand back and turned slightly, the firelight catching the curve of her cheek. "Good night, my lord," she said gently. He stood as well. "Good night, Prudence." She left the room with her spine straight and her heart not yet trembling, but not entirely still either. And behind her, the Earl remained by the fire, watching its embers, as if in their glow he had seen something he had not dared to seek. By midwinter, Thornhaven had awakened from its stillness. The hall, which for months had echoed only with the soft murmur of servants and the whisper of the wind through corridors, now pulsed with preparations. Footmen moved briskly under the Dowager Countess's command, carrying linens and polishing silver until every reflection shone like captured light. Fresh flowers, pale and perfumed, were brought in from the conservatory to grace tables draped in white lace. The grand mirrors of the west drawing-room were unveiled for the first time since the late Countess's passing. Prudence watched it all with a calm she did not entirely feel. The Dowager had decided, without consultation, that Thornhaven must reintroduce itself to society. It would host a small winter gathering for old friends of the family, a phrase that carried the weight of duty disguised as civility. To the Dowager, it was both a test and a statement. The new Lady Thornhaven would be presented properly, her composure examined, her pedigree measured against whispers. Prudence submitted with outward grace, though beneath the surface unease rippled like wind through heather. The morning of the gathering dawned pale and mercilessly cold. A thin veil of snow softened the lawns, and every sound outside seemed muffled by it. Inside, the hall was a fever of motion. Prudence dressed slowly in her chamber, aided by a maid she barely knew. The gown had been chosen by the Dowager herself, a gown of muted emerald silk, high-necked and severe, its beauty subdued to the point of invisibility. Prudence could not tell whether this was a kindness or a calculated restraint. She gazed at her reflection in the mirror. The woman who looked back was not the shopkeeper of Edinburgh, nor the scholar of dried petals and careful ink. She was the Countess of Thornhaven, mistress of a house built upon grief and legacy. Yet beneath the polished surface, her pulse betrayed her composure. When the first guests arrived, the hall filled with warmth and candlelight. The sound of carriage wheels over gravel gave way to laughter, silk rustling, and the polite exchange of pleasantries. The Dowager stood near the hearth, resplendent in amethyst crepe, her expression that of a queen in exile. At her side, Benedict, tall and austere in his black waistcoat and white cravat, greeted guests with a gravity that drew every eye. And then there was Lady Venetia Moresby. Her entrance was quiet but devastating. She wore mourning grey trimmed with silver lace, her gloves pearl white, her every gesture polished to art. A widow of refinement and consequence, Venetia had once been a frequent guest of Thornhaven in Benedict's late wife's time. Her gaze, when it settled on him, softened with familiarity. When it turned to Prudence, however, it cooled to civility, edged with curiosity. "My dear Lady Thornhaven," she said, curtsying lightly. "What a pleasure to see the hall revived. We were beginning to wonder if the Earl had buried it along with his heart." Prudence's smile did not falter. "Houses, like hearts, require care to endure the seasons. I do what I can." Venetia's lips curved in polite approval, but her eyes, blue and precise, betrayed the faintest flicker of disdain. Through the evening, conversation swirled like the flicker of 100 candles. Benedict moved among the guests with ease, exchanging handshakes and brief words. Prudence followed his mother's lead, engaging in the gentle diplomacy of introductions and inquiries. Yet everywhere she went, she felt the undercurrent of speculation. It clung to her like a fine mist. Who is she? How long will she last? Does she know she lives in another woman's shadow? By the time dinner was served, that shadow had taken shape. The portrait of the late Countess Catherine hung directly across from the long dining table, her painted eyes watching the feast below with eternal serenity. When the footman lit the chandeliers, the crystals scattered light across the painting's surface, making the silk of her gown shimmer as though alive. During the soup course, Prudence heard it, barely a whisper, yet sharp enough to pierce through the hum of conversation. "She is nothing like her," a woman murmured behind a fan. "The first Countess could never be replaced." The words slid into her chest like ice. Prudence did not look up. Her spoon continued its steady path from bowl to lips, but her throat tightened, and her hand trembled ever so slightly before she set the utensil down. She felt the dowager's gaze upon her, assessing, measuring. Across the table, Benedict's voice rose in polite conversation with the guest, his tone unchanged, unaware, or pretending not to be aware, of the small cruelty that had been spoken. His face, illuminated by the flickering light, was calm and unreadable. To everyone else, it was the face of composure. To Prudence, it was the mask of a man long practiced in endurance. When the evening drew to a close, guests retreated to the drawing room for port and conversation. Laughter resumed, but to Prudence it sounded distant, hollow. She excused herself quietly and ascended the staircase, her steps measured though her chest burned with a mixture of shame and anger she could not name. In her chamber, she stood by the window overlooking the snowy lawns. The reflection of candlelight trembled against the glass. She removed her gloves and laid them on the table, fingers pale against the dark wood. The words would not leave her mind, could never be replaced. Later that night, unable to sleep, Prudence left her room. The hall was silent now, the guests gone, the servants dismissed. Only the low glow of embers lit the grand corridor. Her bare feet whispered against the carpet as she made her way to the library, the one place in the house that felt honest. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and old paper. The fire had been banked, but enough warmth lingered to soften the chill. She moved to the shelves and traced her fingers along the spines of the books, needing the solidity of their presence. Then she heard the door open. Benedict entered quietly, still in his formal attire, though his cravat hung loose now, his expression weary. "I wondered if I would find you here," he said. Prudence turned toward him, composed but resolute. "Then you have your answer." He studied her face. "You left the gathering early. Were you unwell?" Her eyes met his. "Not unwell, my lord. Only reminded." He stepped closer, his brow furrowing. "Of what?" "That I am not her," she said simply. "That no matter what I do, no matter how gracefully I play the part, there will always be someone whispering that I am the shadow to another woman's light." Benedict's jaw tightened. "People speak because they are idle. You owe them nothing." "But I owe myself something," she replied, her voice trembling slightly, though her gaze did not waver. "I will not live in comparison. I will not warm the seat of another's ghost. If this is what you intended when you asked me here, to fill a space, to be convenient, then say so. I will endure it, but I will not mistake it for love or partnership." The silence that followed was long and heavy. The fire cracked, scattering a few sparks that vanished before touching the floor. When he finally spoke, his tone was low, almost reverent. "That is not what I intended." He took another step forward, close enough that the light revealed the exhaustion in his face. The kind born not of labor, but of years spent holding everything together alone. "When I married Catherine," he said, "I believed that was what life required of me. She was kind, loyal, deserving of more than I gave her. But she was chosen for me, not by me. Our marriage was arrangement, not union." He paused, the confession hanging in the air. "I thought I had grown too cold for anything else. But since you came here, since you spoke to Elspeth as if she were not a relic of grief, but a child still alive, I have begun to feel something I thought long buried." He looked at her then, not with pity nor apology, but with a kind of quiet clarity that made her breath falter. "I do not ask you to accept my past," he said, "only to believe that you are not its echo." The words lodged in her heart with the weight of truth. She turned her gaze to the fire, unable to trust her own composure. "You should not say such things unless you mean them, Benedict." He stepped closer still, but stopped within the boundary of restraint that both of them could feel. "I have never said anything I did not mean." Their eyes met. For a moment, the air between them trembled, not with passion unrestrained, but with something rarer, deeper, a recognition that defied words. Prudence drew in a slow breath, her pulse steadying. "Then good night, my lord." "Good night, Prudence," he murmured. When she left, her footsteps were soft upon the carpet, her shadow passing beneath the watchful portraits of those who came before. And in the drawing-room below, long after the last candle had burned low, the Dowager Countess sat alone, her hands clasped around an old mourning brooch. Through the silence, she thought of the way Venetia's laughter had sounded, too bright, too practiced, and of the way her son's gaze had followed his new wife's retreating form. For the first time, doubt crept into her certainty. She looked down at the brooch, the jet stones dull against her pale skin, and whispered to herself what she would never say aloud. "Perhaps," she murmured, "the house is not done with love after all." The Highlands held their breath as winter deepened its claim. For days, a strange stillness had reigned over Thornhaven Glen, as though nature itself waited for something to break. The sky hung heavy, grey with warning. The air bore the scent of rain, not yet fallen, and the river that ran through the valley swelled with the melting snow from distant peaks, its waters faster, louder, more volatile than any had expected for that time of year. By the afternoon of the third day the storm arrived, not with thunder, but with a sudden howl of wind that bent trees and lashed against the old stones of the hall. The first raindrops struck with force, cold and urgent. Within minutes, the downpour became a sheet of silver. From the upper windows, Prudence watched it blanket the land, watched the distant ridges vanish into mist. She felt it in her chest, the rhythm of the land thrown off balance. Then came the sound, hurried footsteps, raised voices below, the heavy clatter of a door flung open. She descended swiftly, skirts gathered in her hands, her boots striking the polished wood of the stairs. In the front hall, a footman stood breathless, mud on his boots and panic in his eyes. "The river's risen, milady," he gasped. "The stone bridge near the tenant crofts. It's collapsed. Livestock trapped on the far bank. And the McCleary boy, he tried to help. He's been hurt." The world narrowed into focus. Prudence did not pause. "Have a wagon prepared. Bring rope, blankets, lanterns, and all the strong hands we can spare. I'll take the back mare. She's sure-footed in the mud." She turned to the steward, who stood stunned at her side. "Send word to the chapel to open its doors. We'll need shelter, fires, clean linens, boil water." "But my lady," he began. Prudence cut him off with a calm sharpness that left no room for protest. "Move." And he did. The storm gave no mercy as she rode out. Rain soaked her cloak within minutes, the hood whipping back from her braided hair. The mare beneath her slipped once on the flooded path, but kept its footing with determined steps. Around them, the glen howled, wind through the crags, water rushing like thunder beneath bridges no longer whole. When she reached the river's edge, chaos met her. Villagers crowded along the bank, shouting through the rain. A cart lay overturned, its wheels half submerged. On the far side, a small figure clung to the rocks, Robbie McCleary, no more than 12, his leg twisted beneath him, his face pale with fear. 2 sheep floundered nearby, trapped by debris. The bridge was gone, torn from its moorings, jagged stones strewn across the water like broken teeth. Prudence dismounted. Her voice, when it rang out, was clear and steady. "We'll make a rope line from that oak to the far bank. We'll anchor the center with weight, then send 2 men across with a litter. Slowly! The boy comes first." No one argued. The villagers moved as if awakened. Ropes were secured. A plank was laid across the narrowest part of the current. 2 men, braced against each pull of the water, crossed the torrent with aching slowness. Prudence stood ankle-deep in mud, shouting instructions, eyes never leaving the child. They made it. Robbie was lifted, trembling, into the waiting arms of neighbours and carried toward the chapel. And then came Benedict. He arrived on horseback, soaked to the skin, his coat plastered to his frame, eyes wide with disbelief. He leapt from the saddle before the horse had even stilled, his boots splashing into the mire. "Prudence," he breathed. She turned toward him, her face streaked with rain and soil, eyes fierce beneath the storm. "We've nearly finished. The boy is safe." He looked past her to the bridge, to the villagers, to the organized chaos that had, until then, lacked his hand. And then he looked back, truly looked, and saw her as he never had before, not as his wife, not as a gentlewoman, but as something elemental, commanding, alive with purpose. "I came as soon as I heard," he said. "You're here now," she replied, her voice low. "That's enough." Together they oversaw the final rescue efforts. The livestock were secured, the injured tended. And when all was done, they rode to the chapel where candles flickered behind fogged glass. Inside, heat and hope had begun to return. The chapel had been transformed into a makeshift infirmary. Children sat wrapped in blankets, their mothers drying their hair with trembling hands. The McCleary boy lay in the corner, bandaged and sleeping, his sister humming softly at his side. Prudence moved among them with quiet assurance, checking wounds, offering dry cloths, murmuring comfort. Her hair had loosened from its braid, strands clinging to her cheeks. Her gloves were long lost. The sleeves of her dress were rolled to the elbows, revealing arms streaked with mud and care. Benedict stood in the doorway and watched. He did not speak. He did not interrupt. He only watched, as though seeing sunlight after years of winter. She had become the center of the room, not by command, but by presence, and he could no longer pretend not to feel the pull of her gravity. Later, after the last child had been tucked into blankets and the fires banked, they rode back to Thornhaven in silence. The storm had passed. The night was calm now, the stars tentative above the clouds. They did not speak as they dismounted in the courtyard, nor as they entered the hall. But when they reached the corridor that led to the east wing, Prudence stopped. The lantern light from a nearby sconce cast her in gold and shadow. She turned toward him, her cloak still dripping, her eyes luminous in the hush. "You were very brave today," he said. She met his gaze. "No braver than the men who crossed the river, or the boy who didn't cry. You led them. I did what needed doing." Benedict stepped closer, close enough that the air between them seemed to thrum with something tender, unspoken. "You have become the heart of this place," he said. "And yet I still feel like a stranger," she confessed, the words barely a breath. "You are not." He raised a hand, hesitated, then brushed a strand of wet hair from her cheek. The contact was light, reverent. Her breath caught. "I see you, Prudence," he whispered. And then, because there were no more defenses left, no more excuses or silences thick enough to hide behind, he kissed her. It was not a kiss of fire or haste or hunger. It was a kiss of knowing, of recognition, of something old, newly awakened. Her hand found the front of his coat, fingers curling into the damp fabric. She did not pull him closer. She did not need to. They were already standing on the edge of something neither had expected to find again. When they parted, her eyes were shining, not from tears, but from the sheer intensity of having been truly seen. And from the top of the staircase above, Elspeth watched. She sat quietly, her sketchbook balanced on her knees, the stub of a pencil in her hand. She said nothing. She made no sound. But on the page before her, she began to draw. A woman standing in the hall, cloaked in rain, a man leaning toward her, his hand upon her cheek, and between them, something that had nothing to do with grief or obligation, something that looked very much like hope. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind was not peace. It was calculation. At Thornhaven Hall, the snow melted slowly in the days that followed, revealing the bruised earth beneath, the broken fence posts, the scattered twigs clinging to hedgerows. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted in subtle, irrevocable ways. Footsteps echoed differently. Doors lingered open longer, servants exchanged glances more often than words, and Prudence, now no longer a quiet presence in the periphery, had begun to listen with sharper intent. Benedict's kiss had stirred something deep within her, not just tenderness, but clarity. She had not come to Thornhaven for affection, but now that it had brushed against her skin like the hush of firelight, she found herself needing more than warmth. She needed truth, stability, integrity. She had seen the estate nearly drown. She would not let it rot beneath deception. In the early hours of morning, before the hall fully awoke, she sat at her writing desk beneath the tall windows of her chamber. The fire burned low, casting golden arcs across her sleeves as she copied numbers from the household ledger onto clean parchment. Her brow furrowed, her fingers ink-stained. The columns before her told a story, but one missing too many pages. At first, the discrepancies had been small. A barrel of flour logged twice, a charge for coal never delivered. But the deeper she looked, the more tangled the accounts became. Seed purchased at double the fair market price, livestock feed recorded for animals no longer on the estate, tools replaced that had never been broken. The steward, Mr. Dalziel, always delivered his monthly reports in perfect order, too perfect. His ink was crisp, his signatures flourished, his pages untouched by smudge or doubt, and that, Prudence now understood, was the first sign that something was wrong. She approached him carefully. Their meeting took place in the study, a cold and narrow room lined with account books and the scent of dried ink. She had chosen a moment when Benedict was out inspecting the upper fields, taking care to arrive alone and without preamble. Dalziel rose when she entered, his smile tight, eyes guarded beneath the veil of politeness. He bowed slightly. "Lady Thornhaven," he said, "how may I be of service?" Prudence met his gaze with composed restraint. "I wish to inquire about the accounts for the Western tenant farms. Some entries do not align with the harvest ledgers." He blinked once, then smiled. "Numbers can be confusing, my lady, particularly to the uninitiated." She did not flinch. "I was raised by a bookseller. Ink is no stranger to me." Dalziel tilted his head. "Indeed. Then I trust you also understand how easily mistakes can happen when dealing with poor handwriting and rough ledgers." "Of course," she replied, voice cool. "But this mistake repeats itself, across 4 pages, and always to the estate's disadvantage." The steward's eyes darkened. "Are you accusing me of impropriety?" "No," she said calmly. "I am asking for clarification. Should I take the matter to Lord Thornhaven directly?" For a moment the room tensed, then Dalziel bowed once more, lower this time. "I will review the ledgers myself," he said. "You shall have my answer before the week ends." She nodded, then turned to leave, but not before noticing the way his hand gripped the edge of the desk just a second too long. That night, the tension in the hall could be felt like a shift in air pressure. Even the candles seemed to burn lower, their flames flickering more nervously. Elspeth lingered outside Prudence's chamber, longer than usual, sketchbook held tightly to her chest. Her cheeks were flushed, not with cold but with unease. Prudence, sensing her agitation, knelt beside her by the firelight and took the child's hands into her own. "Elspeth," she asked gently, "has something happened?" The girl hesitated, her lips parting, eyes wide. She looked toward the door, as though expecting someone to appear. Then she leaned closer and whispered words that would not soon be forgotten. "He came into the nursery when I was drawing alone. He told me not to speak to you, that you asked too many questions." Prudence froze. Her heart slammed once violently against her ribs. "Who told you that?" Elspeth lowered her voice to a whisper of dread. "Mr. Dalziel. He said, if I talked too much, Papa would send me away." It took all of Prudence's will not to betray the rage that surged within her. She wrapped the girl in her arms, held her tightly. "You will never be sent away," she murmured. "Not by me, not by anyone." Later, when Elspeth had been tucked safely into bed under the watchful eye of her governess, Prudence went to find Benedict. She discovered him in the west corridor, returning from the stables. Snow clung to his boots, and his expression was shadowed with weariness. But the moment he saw her face, he paused. "What is it?" he asked. "I need to speak with you, in private." In the library, by the fire, she told him everything. The discrepancies in the accounts, the inflated prices, the false entries, and most of all, Elspeth's confession. Benedict listened in silence, his brow furrowed deeper with each word, his hands clenched at his sides. But when she finished, he did not react as she expected. He did not storm into action. He did not declare war on the steward. He hesitated. "You must understand," he said slowly. "Dalziel has been with this estate for nearly 2 decades. He was here when I inherited it, when Catherine was still alive. He's respected." Prudence's heart fell. "And that is reason enough to dismiss Elspeth's fear, to ignore numbers that do not add up?" "No," he said, rubbing his temple, "but I must consider the consequences. If you are right, and I do not say you are not, it would mean scandal. It would mean doubt cast upon every tenant record, every financial arrangement made in the last 10 years. She stepped closer, her voice rising, not in anger, but in heartbreak. "Your daughter was threatened. She was made to feel unsafe in her own home. And you worry about scandal?" His gaze met hers, full of turmoil. "I worry," he whispered, "that I cannot afford to be wrong." She looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded once and turned away. As she left, he did not call her back, but someone else had been listening. From the corner of the drawing room, cloaked in shadow, the Dowager Countess had stood behind the half-closed door. Her hands, clasped tightly at her waist, trembled with something she could not name. Elspeth's name had been spoken, and for the first time since Prudence had arrived, doubt crept into the Countess's proud certainty. Not doubt in Prudence, doubt in the man she had raised. She looked toward the stairwell, where Elspeth's drawings were tucked in a basket, sketches of birds, of wildflowers, and recently of a woman holding a lantern beside a bridge, a woman who had risked herself to save others. The Dowager sat down, slowly, her old fingers tracing the edge of the brooch at her collar. Perhaps the girl was no longer the only one watching, and perhaps the new Lady Thornhaven deserved more than scrutiny. Perhaps she deserved trust. The air at Thornhaven had shifted again, no longer heavy with storm or sorrow, but tinged with something sharper, something metallic, like the scent of iron in water. It came with the carriages, with the polished boots on gravel and voices too smooth to be sincere. It came with power draped in silk, and with smiles that did not quite reach the eyes. And it came with Sir Lionel Kincraig. The first sign of his arrival was the echoing crack of horse hooves against the stone courtyard. His coat was of the finest navy wool, cut sharp and tight to his tall frame, his cravat knotted in a way that suggested ease, but had clearly taken care. His dark hair, peppered with distinguished streaks of silver, was slicked back like a man who had never known the wind to defy him. He stepped from his carriage with the languid confidence of someone who had never once been told no. "Cousin," he said as Benedict emerged from the main door, "it's been far too long. Thornhaven looks unchanged." The word was not quite a compliment. "Some things endure," Benedict replied, voice cool. Prudence, watching from the upper gallery, observed the exchange through the carved balustrade. She had never met Sir Lionel before, but she knew his name. In Edinburgh it was whispered in drawing rooms and printed in political pamphlets. He owned factories and contracts and men. More importantly, he owned ambition, quiet, ruthless, and unrelenting. That evening, the hall was once again transformed into a stage. The drawing rooms were reopened, lamps were polished. The silver was brought out, gleaming like judgment. Sir Lionel was hosting a banquet. He called it a celebration of progress, a term that made Prudence's blood run cold. "It's a small affair," Benedict had told her earlier. "Just a few landowners, some men from the council. He says it's time Thornhaven welcomed the future." She had looked at him for a long moment, then said only, "The future does not erase the present, or the people in it." He had not answered. The night of the banquet, Prudence dressed in muted blue silk, her bodice modest, her hair swept back with deliberate restraint. She chose no necklace, no brooch. Only the truth would adorn her tonight. She descended the staircase slowly, the murmur of voices rising below like the sea before a storm. At the foot of the stairs stood the Dowager Countess, resplendent in violet velvet, her expression unreadable. "Speak only when addressed," the Dowager murmured as Prudence approached. "This is not your evening." Prudence paused, then offered a small, cold smile. "No, madam, it is no one's evening, not yet." The drawing room sparkled with candlelight and calculated civility. Sir Lionel stood at its centre, glass in hand, surrounded by men in heavy coats and women with laughter like porcelain. His voice carried above the rest, warm and persuasive, as he spoke of railways and prosperity, of connections to Glasgow and beyond, of change that could no longer be delayed. When he raised his glass, all turned to Benedict. "My cousin," he said, smiling. "The Earl of Thornhaven is not only a man of principle, but, I believe, of vision, and he will be the first to embrace what must come." Prudence's gaze flew to Benedict. He did not rise, but he did nod, a small, hesitant motion, enough to be seen, enough to wound. After the applause, Prudence excused herself and left the room. Her hands trembled, not with rage, but with humiliation. In that moment, she saw it all too clearly, the hall becoming a station, the glen carved by tracks, the crofters displaced, their dignity signed away with a stroke of a pen. And she saw herself, silent as she had been instructed. Not tonight, not ever again. The next morning, before the frost had melted from the fields, she packed a small case and requested the early train to Edinburgh. Benedict found her in the entrance hall, gloved and cloaked, her bonnet in hand. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice tight. "To find the truth," she said, "because it clearly does not live here." He reached for her arm, but she stepped back. "You nodded," she whispered. "That room believed your silence meant consent." "I haven't signed anything," he said, jaw clenched. "But you will," she answered, "if someone doesn't show you what your signature will cost." The journey to Edinburgh was cold and long. The train creaked through snowy valleys, its windows fogged, its rhythm steady like a pulse. Prudence sat alone in a private compartment, notebook open in her lap. But instead of drawing wildflowers or plant specimens, she wrote names, dates, ledgers, prices that did not add up. By the time she reached the city, her resolve was sharpened to steel. She went first to Mr. Ainsley, an aging barrister and friend of her late father, whose office smelled of pipe smoke and dust. "You're certain?" he asked, peering at her notes through thick spectacles. "I am," she said, "but I need more than speculation." He rubbed his beard thoughtfully. "I know a maid who worked briefly in Sir Lionel's Edinburgh office. Left without notice. Said she saw something she shouldn't have. I'll find her." Prudence waited for hours in the barrister's study, listening to the city beyond the frosted glass. When he returned, he was not alone. The maid was no more than 16, pale and nervous, her hands twisting in her skirt. Prudence sat beside her, speaking softly, without pressure, and the girl wept. She spoke of letters burned before they could be mailed, of ledgers rewritten, of land parcels marked for sale before any consent was given. Prudence took it all down. Mr. Ainsley gave her a sealed envelope before she left. "These are documents Lionel thought destroyed, copies of lease transfers prepared in advance, with dates from last month." In the train carriage home, Prudence sat with the envelope in her lap and her notebook spread open beside it. She did not draw petals. She drew the hall, its wings, its roads, the glen, and over it the spider's web of lines that threatened to strangle it all. She drew not as a botanist, not as a countess, but as a woman preparing for battle. Behind her, the sun sank into the hills, its light stained with fire. Before her, Thornhaven waited, still dressed in silk, still listening to liars, but not for long. The war would not come with swords or cannons. It would come with ink, with voices, with truth, and she would not return as an ornament. She would return as the storm. The sky over Thornhaven was the colour of lead, flat, dim, unmoving, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. Snow had fallen during the night, a light dusting that veiled the grounds in stillness, but offered no comfort. It was the kind of morning that quieted birds and slowed footsteps, when even the ticking of clocks seemed too loud. Inside the great hall of the estate, preparations had begun before dawn. Chairs were placed in measured rows, their carved backs turned toward the long stone hearth. A great table stood at the front, draped in the dark green velvet used only for estate business, the crest of Thornhaven stitched in faded gold thread at its centre. The fire had been lit early, but the chill still clung to the corners of the room, as if reluctant to yield. Benedict stood at one end of the hearth, hands clasped behind his back, face carved from stone, dressed in black with no cravat, no ornament, only the simple silver ring bearing his family's seal. He did not speak. He watched, he listened, and he waited. Across the hall, villagers filed in one by one, men in woolen coats still smelling of livestock, women with tired eyes and hands red from work. They did not speak loudly. No one did. There was an air of uncertainty, yes, but beneath it, something deeper. Expectation. At precisely 10 o'clock, Prudence entered. She was neither rushed nor tentative. Her posture was straight, her chin lifted. She wore a slate-grey gown that matched the colour of the sky, high-collared and severe, with no adornment save the silver thistle brooch at her throat, the very symbol of endurance. In her arms, she carried a bundle of parchment tied with ribbon. She walked past the villagers, past the dowager countess seated in the front row, past Elspeth sitting beside her, hands curled into the folds of her cloak, and she met Benedict's eyes. He gave the smallest nod. She took her place at the table. "I speak today," she began, her voice clear, "not as a lady, nor as the wife of this estate's master, but as a witness, a keeper of records, and a woman who has come to love the land you live on." A murmur passed through the room, then faded. Prudence untied the bundle and laid out the documents with deliberate care. For months now, the tenants of Thornhaven have faced increased rents, shortened leases, and sudden notices of arrears. Some have been threatened with eviction. Others have been told to accept less or leave. I have reviewed these records myself, compared them to purchase orders, shipping receipts, and signed ledgers. What I found was not negligence. She paused. Her gaze swept the room. It was betrayal. Gasps rose from the villagers. One woman clutched her husband's hand. An elder man removed his cap, eyes narrowing in disbelief. Prudence held up a document. "This is an eviction notice dated 3 weeks ago, claiming non-payment from a tenant who had, in fact, paid in full. The steward's signature appears here, but this is not his hand. I compared it to 5 other documents." She held up another page. "This is a contract between Thornhaven and a supplier based in Glasgow. The price listed for barley seed is double the fair market value. The same supplier is registered under a shell company, one owned by Sir Lionel Kincraig." A stunned silence filled the hall. Across the room, Sir Lionel sat rigid, his hands folded before him, jaw tight. His lips curved into a smile that did not reach his eyes. "This is slander," he said coldly. "You're a wife with too much time and not enough sense." Before Prudence could answer, another voice rose, small, uncertain, and heartbreakingly clear. "He lied." All eyes turned. Elspeth had stood. She stepped forward, clutching her sketchbook. Her voice shook, but she did not stop. "Mr. Dalziel came into the nursery. He told me not to talk to anyone. He said if I did, my papa would send me away. He said my drawings were nonsense." Her voice faltered. She looked at Prudence, who gave her the faintest nod. Elspeth straightened her back. "He scared me, and he was lying." A shocked murmur swept through the room. From the corner, Mr. Dalziel stepped back as if struck. His face had drained of colour. I never," he stammered, then turned to Benedict. "My lord, this is a child's tale." Benedict's voice cut through the room like a blade. "A child's courage, Mr. Dalziel, something you clearly lack." Dalziel's eyes darted to Sir Lionel, but the man beside him offered no assistance. And then, before the magistrates could even rise from their seats, Dalziel fled. He turned on his heel and bolted through the side door, his coat flapping behind him like a wounded flag. Gasps, shouts, but no one stopped him. It did not matter. He was already defeated. Sir Lionel remained seated, his expression unchanged, though a vein pulsed at his temple. Benedict turned to him. "You will answer for this." "I have done nothing illegal," Lionel replied, folding his arms. "No," said Prudence, stepping forward. "You've done something worse. You have preyed on trust. You have disguised theft as enterprise. You have turned family into leverage." She placed one final document on the table. "The transfer orders. Signed by your solicitor before Benedict was even approached, dated, stamped, and now public." At that moment, a clerk stepped forward with a copy of the local press. The story had already gone to print. Sir Lionel's smile cracked. "Be careful," he said, his voice low. "You've made a powerful enemy." Prudence lifted her chin. "Not nearly as powerful as the truth." The magistrates spoke. They declared the documents sufficient cause for investigation. The leases would be halted. All evictions suspended pending review. The estate, they ruled, would remain under Thornhaven's control, but its management must be reformed, with transparency. As the room began to shift, chairs scraping, voices rising in a mix of relief and disbelief, one figure remained seated, the Dowager Countess. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her eyes, sharp and unreadable, were fixed on Elspeth. Then, slowly, she rose. The room quieted once more. She stepped forward, her cane tapping softly against the stone, and stood before the villagers of Thornhaven. "I have spent my life defending tradition," she began. "I believed it was my duty, to the name, to the house, to the memory of what came before. I taught my son to carry that weight, and I have watched my daughter-in-law with suspicion, because she did not arrive with the right name, the right lineage, the right silence." She paused. Her voice, always composed, now trembled ever so slightly. "But this house has endured not because of bloodlines, but because of those who dared to protect it. Prudence Carrow is such a woman. She has faced what we would not. She has spoken when others would have whispered. She turned her gaze to the magistrates, to the villagers, to Benedict. Let no woman be dismissed for the name she bore at birth, or for the courage she brings with her." Her voice broke, barely, but enough. She returned to her seat beside Elspeth, who reached out silently and took her hand. And as the fire crackled in the hearth behind them, Thornhaven breathed. Not in grief, not in fear, but in something new, justice. Spring arrived not with a trumpet, but with a whisper. It crept into the glen on soft winds, scented with thawed moss and newborn petals, and for the first time in many months, Thornhaven Hall no longer stood as a fortress of silence and suspicion. Instead, its windows had been thrown open to let in birdsong and the scent of damp earth, and its people, those who had once walked in fear, now paused to speak in low tones of possibility. At the heart of it all stood Prudence Carrow. No longer merely a guest, nor a shadow in borrowed rooms, she moved through the estate with quiet authority, her presence a thread pulling the frayed pieces of a household into coherence. Benedict had handed her the rebuilding, not with ceremony, but with the quiet conviction of a man who no longer needed to prove his trust, and she had taken it, not as a favour, but as a charge. The first door she opened was not the drawing room, nor the old study, but the long-sealed greenhouse at the edge of the southern grounds. For years it had stood locked and neglected, its glass panes dulled by moss, its hinges stiff with rust. The key, dusty and cold in her palm, turned with effort. The groan of the door as it opened was like an exhale from a forgotten world. Inside, the air was thick and close, saturated with the scent of rotting mulch and something fainter, ghosts of herbs and citrus, long dead. Broken pots lay scattered across the floor. Ivy had clawed its way through cracks in the glass, but beneath the ruin, life lingered. She found a single fern, curled tightly in its pot, pale but still breathing. By noon, she had rolled up her sleeves, tied back her hair with twine, and begun. She swept and pruned, catalogued what could be salvaged, and drafted new plans on parchment as the sun moved steadily across the glass roof. Her hands, once used to pressing petals between books, were now stained with honest soil. The greenhouse became a symbol, but not a metaphor. It was work, restorative, stubborn, necessary. And from that space of quiet labor, new visions began to take shape. A seed bank to protect heirloom varieties from extinction. A schoolroom near the tenant cottages where girls would learn to read maps and boys to prune apple boughs. A council made not of titled men, but of those who knew the land by the ache in their knees. When Benedict passed her one afternoon, pausing in the gravel path outside the glass to watch her lay irrigation lines, he did not interrupt. He only tipped his head in reverent acknowledgement, as though bowing to something sacred. Meanwhile, inside the hall, another form of healing was underway. The Dowager Countess had taken up her station in the music room, where she now taught Elspeth scales and Scottish airs on the pianoforte. No one had suggested it. She had simply begun. Twice a week she also sat with the child in the morning parlour, reading aloud from the journals of the late Earl, her husband. The volumes were worn and annotated, full of botanical observations and Highland folklore. There, in those shared silences, Elspeth had begun to ask questions. Not timid ones, but brave, searching inquiries about her grandfather's decisions, her mother's illness, the meaning of land and belonging. And the Dowager, once a woman who answered only with arched brows or cool nods, had begun to respond. Prudence saw it all from the periphery, never intruding. She did not wish to claim credit, but she felt the ripple of it as clearly as she did the warmth returning to the greenhouse. One overcast morning, while sorting through a crate of old volumes labelled Herbals and Healing, she discovered a worn copy of Linnaeus's Systema Naturae. Slipped between the pages, nearly forgotten, was a folded note in her own hand. It had been written in another lifetime. The ink had faded to brown. The folds had left the paper soft as cloth. It was not addressed to anyone, nor signed. Simply a list, neatly written and painfully honest. Things I will not have. Love. A child. A place of my own. A partner who sees me. She sat very still for a long time, the paper trembling faintly in her hand. Then, slowly, she turned it over and, in ink darker and steadier than before, began a new list. Things I have begun to believe. That love need not come young to be deep. That a child's laughter can knit torn hearts. That the land may bloom when tended by equal hands. That I am not afraid any more. She folded both lists together and placed them in her pocket. That evening, the conservatory glowed with lamplight and soft shadows. Spring blossoms, delicate hellebores, narcissus and early tulips, trembled in the warmth of the enclosed air. The irrigation system Prudence had mended trickled quietly, a steady murmur like a heartbeat through the pipes. There were no guests, no priest, no music. Only Elspeth, standing solemnly at the centre in a soft green dress, her sketchbook tucked beneath her arm. And Benedict, waiting in his shirt sleeves and waistcoat, his coat draped over a chair, his hair still tousled from wind and work. When Prudence entered, wearing a dress the colour of heather and a ribbon she had dyed with larkspur, he turned to her, not with ceremony, but with awe. His expression did not shift into performance. It remained exactly as it had been when he first looked through the greenhouse door that afternoon and found her replanting fragile shoots. They stood beneath the trellis arch that once held only vines and now bloomed again. He did not speak first. She did. "I cannot promise ease," she said, her voice steady but low, "or elegance, or obedience. I never asked for any of those," he replied. "I will question, I will intervene, I will not keep peace if peace comes at the cost of truth." He took her hands. They were scarred and strong from months of soil, and he held them like parchment too precious to crease. "Then we are well matched." Elspeth stepped forward. Between her palms, she held a small posy of violets and wood sorrel, tied with twine. She looked from one to the other, then placed it gently in Prudence's hand. "For the seed bank," she whispered. "You'll need something to begin with." No grand pronouncement was made, no rings exchanged. Only vows spoken not to bind, but to build. Promises forged not for show, but for soil and skin and future breath. Later that night, as the moon climbed above the conservatory roof and the scent of jasmine drifted from the corner beds, Prudence remained awake long after Elspeth had fallen asleep in the nursery and Benedict had dozed by the hearth. She sat in the window alcove of the music room, holding the old note in one hand, the new one in the other. Below, the greenhouse light still flickered, soft as stars. For the first time in her life, she felt the world not as something to withstand, but as something she could shape. Tomorrow, there would be planting, letters to send, ledgers to adjust. But tonight, she let herself rest in the fullness of something rare and quiet, peace earned, not gifted, love chosen, not chased, and a place not merely occupied, but reclaimed. The sun rose golden over the glen, casting a tender warmth on the valley that had, for too long, known only silence and survival. Thornhaven, once a place of watchful shadows and whispered warnings, now stirred with the hum of anticipation. From the crofts and cottages to the high ridge above the river, laughter echoed as the village prepared for a spring festival not celebrated in over 10 years. Children darted past, hanging bunting strung between oaks and old pines, their fingers dusted with flour and wildflowers. Women unpacked jars of jam and oatcakes onto long trestle tables, while men adjusted fiddle strings and tuned pipes by ear. The rebuilt bridge, sleek, solid and simple, arched gracefully over the stream, a symbol of quiet triumph. Its stones bore no plaque, no inscription, but every footstep across it carried the weight of memory and the promise of passage. At the center of it all stood Prudence. She wore a gown of soft plum wool, practical and unpretentious, with a sash embroidered by Elspeth's hand. Her hair, pulled into a loose chignon at the nape of her neck, had been pinned with sprigs of rosemary and gorse. As she moved among the villagers, greeting old men with handshakes and young mothers with listening smiles, no one called her "my lady," though they might have. They called her Prudence, and it was enough. Elspeth, nearly skipping in her enthusiasm, wove through the crowds in a sea-foam green dress with puffed sleeves and a ribbon trailing from her bonnet. Her sketchbook, new, thick and crisply bound, hung from a leather strap across her chest. She paused to draw the bridge, then a girl dancing, then a field where buttercups bloomed. Gone was the child who hid behind stair rails and shut doors. In her place was someone laughing freely, limbs loose with joy, heart unguarded. Near the platform erected by the council, Benedict stood, tall and composed, a sheaf of papers in hand. His waistcoat was dark green, the fabric brushed wool from local mills, and the silver chain of his father's pocket watch glinted in the morning light. His eyes, however, never stopped scanning the crowd, for Elspeth, yes, but also for Prudence. And when they met hers across the field, a current passed between them, gentle and unmistakable. He stepped up to the dais without fanfare, nodding to the tenants and elders gathered before him. When he spoke, his voice was calm, yet resonant. Today is not about the rebuilding of stone or the redrawing of maps. It is about something older and far more difficult: trust. For generations, that word was offered only one way, from landowner to tenant, with little asked and less explained. That ends now. He lifted the parchment and read from the new lease model, drafted in Prudence's hand and revised after long nights of shared counsel. It protected generational rights, banned arbitrary evictions, guaranteed access to communal grazing land, and made provisions for education, widow stipends, and seasonal council meetings. No one cheered at first. They were too stunned. Then someone, a young crofter near the front, let out a breathless laugh of disbelief. Another man clapped. Then a woman raised her kerchief and shouted, "It's real!" Applause broke like rain over dry earth, and Benedict did not bow, nor smile broadly. He simply looked toward the foot of the platform where Prudence stood, eyes shining, hand resting gently on her midsection, in a motion that might have passed unnoticed, if not for the unmistakable tenderness with which she held herself. Whispers had begun, of course. Mrs. Kinross's new colour, her glowing skin, the sudden sharpness with which the dowager had scolded the cook for leaving wine vinegar in the pantry, but no one spoke of it directly. Not yet. That afternoon, beneath the birch trees that lined the village green, music began in earnest. Fiddlers played jigs so lively, even the elderly tapped their canes in time. Children twirled in circles. A small girl offered Elspeth a daisy crown, which she accepted solemnly and then placed atop Prudence's hair with theatrical precision. "You must wear it," she said. "It's tradition." "Is it?" Prudence asked with amusement. "I just decided it is." The festival continued until late. Bread was broken, stories were shared, and as the sun dipped behind the hills, news arrived via a breathless rider from the post. The railway had been rerouted. The petition, signed by over 300 villagers and accompanied by Prudence's testimony, had not merely swayed local officials. It had reached Parliament. The line would now curve west of the glen, preserving the meadows and ancestral homes of the Thornahaven tenants. There were gasps, tears. One man fell to his knees and kissed the hem of Benedict's coat until the Earl gently lifted him and said, "It was your voices that changed this, not mine." As twilight settled, the villagers lit lanterns across the hill paths, hundreds of them, floating beacons of flame in glass. They lined the roads, the footbridges, the riverbank. From the conservatory at the hall, it looked as if the stars had fallen to earth. In the parlour, the Dowager Countess removed a small velvet case from her escritoire. It had belonged to her mother-in-law, a woman whose memory she rarely invoked. Inside was a jet brooch, oval and delicate, carved with the image of a thistle, entwined with a lily. She found Prudence by the window, watching the lanterns glow like fireflies. "This," the Dowager said, fastening the brooch onto the sash of Prudence's gown, "was given to me when I married. It is not an heirloom, it is a choice." Prudence turned, eyes wide. "Are you certain?" "I am not in the habit of jesting, nor of undoing what has been done, but I have learned." Slowly, her voice wavered. "You belong now." No further words passed between them. None were needed. That night, Benedict found Prudence on the hillside behind the hall, where the heather had just begun to bloom in cautious clusters. The air was cool but not biting. She had wrapped herself in a shawl of moss green, and when he approached, she leaned back against him without turning. They stood that way for a long time, watching the lanterns shimmer across the landscape like blessings. He rested a hand over hers, just above the curve of her belly. "Will it be a boy?" he asked quietly. "I don't know." "A girl, then?" "I only hope," her voice caught, "that she grows up knowing that no door is closed forever, that love does not ask for perfection, only courage." Benedict pressed a kiss to her temple. "Then she will know it, because she will learn from you." Prudence watched a cluster of children chase one another down the slope, their laughter carried on the wind. Elspeth among them, hair undone, cheeks flushed with life. And as the final lanterns were lit, flickering into existence one by one across the ridgeline, she whispered, barely audible, "We are not just surviving, my love. We are growing." And the hills, once silent, held her words like a prayer answered. The heather bloomed early that year. It spread in wide, violet swaths across the hills of Thornhaven, like a memory reborn, vivid and defiant. The air carried a faint scent of peat and lilac, and the earth, always slow to thaw, had yielded to warmth with a tenderness rarely seen so soon. Birds nested beneath the eaves of the conservatory, where vines had long since overtaken the walls, and the stream by the old bridge gurgled with the urgency of youth. In the glen below, laughter rippled through the fields. Children chased ribbons in the wind, their boots muddied, their voices bright. At the heart of them ran a girl of 6 with honey-brown curls and a stubborn chin. Her name was Moira, and she never waited to be invited. She burst into the greenhouse, cheeks flushed, a daisy clenched in one fist. "Papa, she won't let me draw the lambs. She says she needs to finish the birch tree first." From behind a line of saplings, Benedict Kinross stood, shaking soil from his gloves. His beard was flecked with silver now, and the lines around his eyes had deepened, not from sorrow, but from squinting too often into the sun while watching his children run wild. "Where is your sister?" he asked. "Reading," Moira replied, scowling. "Again." Elspeth, now 14, sat cross-legged on the stone wall just outside, sketchbook open, charcoal smudged across her fingers. She no longer hid her drawings. In fact, she had begun sending them, skies, birds, villages, to a small press in Edinburgh. The editor, unaware of her age, had written back with wonder. Inside the greenhouse, Prudence knelt beside a row of herb cuttings, her movements careful, her expression serene. Time had not dulled her, it had sculpted her. Her hair, streaked now with silver, was pinned in the same quiet twist she had worn the day she arrived at Thornhaven, though a stubborn lock always slipped loose to brush her cheek. She rose when Benedict entered, brushing soil from her apron. "She's drawn the same birch tree 3 times this week. She'll draw it 30 times more," he said, kissing her brow. Their love had not burned. It had endured. Like stone smoothed by wind, it had changed shape with the years. There had been no grand declarations since their vows beneath the conservatory blossoms. Only quiet assurances in passing glances, in fingers brushing across tables, in the act of waking each morning to face the day, side by side. The estate had changed too. The tenant council had grown, and the school now held 25 students. The seed bank Prudence founded expanded to include medicinal plants, and she trained a young apothecary who now served the region. The railway never came near Thornhaven. Instead, a modest postal line connected the glen to the rest of the Highlands, and that was all anyone desired. The Dowager Countess no longer occupied the East Wing. She had passed quietly in her sleep 2 winters prior, her hand clasped around the jet brooch she had once gifted Prudence. Her final months had been spent reading aloud to Moira, correcting Elspeth's French conjugations, and penning letters to other noblewomen who, she claimed, needed radical re-education in common sense. She left her journals to Prudence. The last line written in her firm hand read, "The only legacy that matters is the one we dare to change." As for Lionel Kincraig, his name had faded from public record. After the exposure and shame, he had withdrawn from public life. Some said he moved to the continent, others whispered of debtor's prison. Benedict never inquired. He had learned the hard way that some battles once won need not be revisited. That evening, as twilight painted the glen in shades of gold and indigo, the family gathered near the rebuilt bridge. Lanterns were being strung for the spring gathering, now an unbroken tradition. Moira held a string of blossoms too tightly, crushing petals with every bounce. Elspeth teased her, then softened, offering to help. Benedict watched his daughters and felt an ache, of fullness, of gratitude, of time slipping through the fingers like water. Prudence stood beside him in a shawl, the colour of dusk. "Do you remember," she said softly, "when you told me you'd never truly shared yourself with anyone before?" He looked at her, the woman who had once catalogued ferns alone in a shop window while the world passed her by. "I don't remember ever not sharing myself with you," he replied. She smiled, eyes glistening. "We planted something, and it took root." They stood hand in hand as the lanterns were lit one by one, stretching from the hilltops to the water's edge, each flicker a quiet testimony, not just to survival, but to love that chose growth, to lives rewritten, to the eldest spinster who once stood unnoticed in the corner, now at the center of a world she helped shape with nothing but patience, conviction, and the courage to bloom. And as the wind stirred the heather, soft and fragrant, it carried with it no sorrow, only the sweet, enduring sound of life continuing. In every season of life, there are moments when we feel overlooked, out of place, or told, directly or quietly, that our time has passed. But the story of Prudence Carrow reminds us that sometimes our greatest chapters begin when we stop waiting for permission and start planting something of our own. She was not the belle of the ball, nor the first to be chosen. She was the one who listened before speaking, who healed instead of conquering, who built slowly and loved deeply. And in doing so, she changed everything. Through storms and silence, betrayal and blossoming trust, Prudence showed us that love, true, enduring love, is not found in grand declarations but in quiet acts of courage day after day. She taught us that it's never too late to begin again, to be seen, to belong. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments. Write the word Heather so we'll know you stayed with us until the very end. That one word, so full of meaning, tells us that you believe in second chances, in resilience, in the beauty of blooming when no one expected you to. If you wish to support the small team that brings these emotional period romances to life, consider sending a super thanks with any amount your heart feels called to give. Every gesture, no matter the size, helps us continue crafting these unforgettable journeys. And if now isn't the right time, sharing this video with a friend who loves historical stories is a beautiful way to help. Your kindness keeps these tales alive. Don't forget to check the cards we've left for you with other deeply emotional, dramatic and romantic stories, each one filled with characters you'll carry in your heart. Thank you for walking this path with us. And remember, some loves take time to grow, but once they do, they last forever.